the harvest that starved. It was December 1620 when the Mayflower finally dropped anchor off the frostbitten coast of what would become Plymouth. 102 souls, men, women, children, stepped onto a land of ice and silence. They had crossed an ocean not for gold, but for God. Not for comfort, but for conscience. Yet the very ideals that brought them here, their longing for purity, for community, for a shared covenant, would nearly destroy them before the first spring thaw. Back in England, they had signed a contract with London merchants, hard-eyed investors who demanded total control over the colony's output. Everything, the timber, the fish, the grain, belonged not to the families who planted and toiled, but to a distant common stock. Private property was forbidden. Labor was communal. And reward was uniform regardless of sweat, sacrifice, or skill. First, this sounded noble. Christian charity, after all, teaches us to care for the widow, the orphan, the poor. But charity freely given is not the same as compulsion disguised as virtue. What the Pilgrims enacted was not love, it was a system. A rigid, enforced equality where effort bore no fruit, and idleness carried no cost. Governor William Bradford, writing years later, described the rot that set in almost immediately. The young men, able and willing to work, grew bitter. Why should they exhaust themselves in the frozen fields only to see their harvest poured into a common store, from which the lazy, the shiftless, and the merely vocal drew the same portion? As Bradford put it, they felt it was injustice that their labor should feed other men's families while their own went without advantage. And the women, many widowed by the winter's plague, were expected not only to care for their own children but to cook and clean for single men who contributed little. They called it, in Bradford's own words, a kind of slavery. This was not the kingdom of heaven on earth. This was a slow suffocation of spirit. The Apostle Paul had warned of this centuries before. In his second letter to the Thessalonians, he wrote with unflinching clarity, "For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat." 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 10, KJV. Later, the settler David Smith, echoing that ancient truth, would declare simply, "He who will not work shall not eat." It seems harsh, until you watch a community starve because no one is hungry enough to act. The communal system didn't just fail to produce crops, it poisoned the soil of human motivation. When reward is severed from effort, when the diligent and the idle receive the same loaf, work becomes performative, then perfunctory, then absent. The strong grow weary, the weak grow cunning, and the public pot, funded by anonymous extraction, becomes a theater of entitlement, where those who scream loudest, who bear the most children not out of love but out of calculation, receive the lion's share. Meanwhile, the very people whose labor sustains the whole, those who rise before dawn, who mend nets in the rain, who plant despite despair, begin to question the cost. Why build a future that others will consume without gratitude or consequence? Why raise children in a world where virtue is punished and dependence rewarded? The result is demographic surrender. The industrious have fewer children, withdraw, conserve. They stop believing in the myth of shared bounty, because they've seen that sharing too often means silent confiscation. And so, the colony inches toward collapse, not from lack of land or sea, but from lack of justice in the soul of its system. This was the lesson Plymouth learned the hard way, in blood, frost, and famine. Not from theory but from graves. Half their number buried in the first winter. Not by storm or sword, but by a philosophy that mistook enforced equality for righteousness. What they didn't know then, but would discover by 1623, was that true charity cannot exist without responsibility. That helping another is noble only when it does not cripple the helper. That public compassion, untethered from personal accountability, becomes not mercy, but moral hazard. But that revelation, the pivot that saved them, would come only after the brink of annihilation. And it would begin with a single radical act, giving each family a plot of land, and the right to keep what they grew. For now, in the winter of 21, they still huddled in shared misery, wondering if survival itself was a sin against their own ideals. They had signed a contract with investors, but the true contract they broke was with human nature, the soil of self-interest. Spring, 1623. The snow had barely melted when Governor Bradford called the colonists together, not for prayer this time, but for reckoning. 2 winters of death, 2 harvests of despair, and one undeniable truth. The communal storehouse, meant to embody Christian brotherhood, had become a tomb of incentives. They had tried to live as if human nature could be overwritten by goodwill. But goodwill, untethered from consequence, curdles. The contract with the London merchants demanded all labor serve the common stock. Yet what is common is, in truth, owned by no one, and thus cared for by no one. It was Robert Cushman who, in his 1621 sermon, had warned them, "Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth." But even he did not mean to sanctify a system where men toiled for strangers while their own children went thin-limbed and hollow-cheeked. He spoke of moral orientation, not economic structure. And now, with half their number buried in unmarked graves, the Pilgrims finally understood the distinction. So Bradford made a quiet revolution. Not with muskets or manifestos, but with seeds and soil. Each family received a plot. Not a gift. Not welfare. A covenant. You sow, you reap. And the transformation was immediate. Bradford recorded it plainly. It made all hands very industrious. Even the women, who once resented cooking for bachelors they'd never chosen to feed, now walked willingly into the fields. Not out of charity, but because the corn they hoed would fill their own children's bowls. Work was no longer a tax on virtue. It became virtue's vehicle. This was not selfishness in the vulgar sense. It was what Ayn Rand, centuries later, would call the virtue of selfishness. Not greed, but the moral right to the product of one's own mind and muscle. The Pilgrims didn't need objectivism to see the truth. When a man cannot keep what he creates, he stops creating. And when he stops creating, everyone starves together. The communal system had done something more insidious than starve bodies. It starved character. Taught dependency as piety. It rewarded volume over virtue. Those with the most mouths to feed, regardless of contribution, drew the same share as those who bled in the frozen furrows. The silent majority, the builders, the planners, the parents who limited their families because they knew scarcity was real, were punished for their prudence. Their restraint became their sentence. And so the colony neared extinction, not from lack of land, not from lack of help, Squanto had given them knowledge enough, but from a moral inversion, where giving without accountability became indistinguishable from theft, and where the diligent were made to fund the idle under the banner of fairness. But in 1623, they broke the spell. They did not abolish compassion. Bradford made sure the truly helpless, orphans, the infirm, were cared for. But that care came not from an anonymous pot, but from neighbors who knew their names, their stories, their worth. Personal charity, not public extraction. There is all the difference in the world between feeding a starving child you hold in your arms and feeding a statistical claimant in a ledger. By 1624, the plots became permanent. Why? Because men plant trees only when they believe their grandchildren will sit in their shade. Temporary ownership breeds temporary effort. Lasting property breeds civilization. Bradford, ever the theologian, saw the deeper sin in the old system. Presumed men could be angels. They acted, he wrote, as if they were wiser than God. For God gave man dominion, not over the collective but over his own labor, his own family, his own conscience. And so the real Thanksgiving was never the feast of 1621, half myth, half diplomatic gesture with the Wampanoag. The true Thanksgiving was the quiet moment in 1623 when a starving man looked at a plot of earth and knew, "This is mine to tend, and what grows here will not be taken from me." From that moment, Plymouth did not merely survive. It began to flourish, not because they abandoned community, but because they restored justice. They learned that you cannot build a society on guilt, coercion, or the loud demands of the unproductive. You build it on earned dignity, on the sacred link between effort and reward. And in that lesson, forged in frost, paid for in graves, lies a warning for every age. When a society robs the strong to feed the weak without demanding improvement, it doesn't create equity. It creates ruin. For the strong grow fewer, the weak grow dependent, and the future, like the Pilgrims' first corn, rots in the common store before anyone can taste its hope. But when each man is free to work, to keep, to build, and bound by conscience to help his neighbor in true need, then and only then does bounty bloom. That was the harvest worth giving thanks for. Not the one shared in November, but the one earned in spring.